Hello again, this is B. I'm just about to start talking to you about the first assignment in the Certificate in Education course, which is assignment 1. This is all about understanding roles, responsibilities and relationships in education and training. And this is the first assignment. It's an assignment which is pitched at level 3 in this particular case. However, when we're working on this assignment within the course, what I'm hoping to see from you is not specifically just the whole business of you writing something which is clearly adequate at level 3, but excelling, really. Trying to excel beyond that and try to get some practice in writing at level 4. And of course for level 4 this means using Harvard referencing. In other words, citing your references and your quotations within the text using the standard format, and also creating a bibliography at the end of the assignment which shows the kind of background reading you've done. Please remember you have to use the Harvard referencing format. This is very important throughout the entire set of assignments. And whereas in assignment 1 there are lots of, if you make mistakes, a lot of it's very forgivable. Later on, as you go through the other assignments, we tighten up on this particular aspect of the course. Please also remember, when you're writing, to write in a kind of what I would say would be a third-person view, as wherever possible. That is to say, try not to talk in terms of I do this, I do that, unless this is relevant to the argument you're making within the text, and whether it's about a narrative or not. Very often you will be quoting from other people's work. It's vital that you show that you've been doing some background reading, and that this background reading should be not just websites, should not just be the educational journals and magazines you may come across during your day-to-day work, but also should be from the standard textbooks, many of which were in the reading list that we gave you at the very start of the course. If you have problems getting access to any of these textbooks, please let me know. We'll see if we can help in some respect with regard to that. Okay, so what does assignment 1 say? It says, carry out research into your own working role and responsibilities as a teacher, taking into account professional teaching standards and key legislation. Professional teaching standards tends to mean the national standards as laid down by both the Institute for Learning, as it was in the past, and now the Education and Training Foundation, the ETF. So the first real port of call should be, I think, for the ETF's website, where you'll take a look at what the national standards look like. Key legislation means those aspects of the law that apply specifically to the kind of roles you have as a teacher. That would include the Equality Act of 2010, that would include things like the Health and Safety at Work Act, that would include those sorts of legislation which have an effect on you. Try not to go too mad on this. The idea is not to produce loads and loads of bulleted lists about the law, but that what you should do is use key legislation. Legislation has a direct effect upon teaching, especially the teaching you do, and teaching in general, and which you can show that you understand and can explain. So don't just give me a list. What I want to do is to show that you understand that by commenting on the legislation that you cite. First of all, part A, produce a written report of your findings, which should include an explanation of the teaching role, a summary of key aspects of legislation, regulatory requirements and codes, an explanation of ways to promote equality and diversity, and an explanation of why it's important to identify and meet individual needs. Okay, teaching role and responsibilities. Think about the various aspects of the way in which teaching operates. There is the institutional role, the idea of the responsibilities you have in terms of going to meetings, taking part in an organization, fulfilling your requirements as an employee, being part of a system, a collegiate system of people who are working jointly on education and training. Think about the administrative role, the business of how you have certain documentation that you have to keep up to date, certain aspects of the work that you do which need to be recorded in terms of assessment, lesson plans, schemes of work, report writing, etc., etc., etc. Think of the pastoral role you also have in terms of how you support students in the work, in the learning they do, in the work they do, in terms of supporting them up to the edge of your competence within the teaching role itself. Remember, if something is beyond your competence, you should advise and refer on students. You should not be intervening yourself in areas which are outside of your competent supervision or your purview. Remember that. Your job has an edge where it stops. Finally, think about the teaching role itself. What your role is in terms of the facilitation, teaching, the learning, the various activities you do, the relationship you have with your students, and so on and so forth. So part 1.1 of Part A deals with this specific area. Part 1.2 of Part A looks at key aspects of legislation, regulatory requirements, and codes of practice. I've already mentioned that before in terms of the national standards, but also codes of practice which you may have which are related to the place where you're working. So for instance, it's a good idea to look in terms of, for instance, the kind of codes of practice you'll find from local authorities such as Gateshead or North Tyneside or Newcastle or wherever you happen to be working, or any organisational codes of practice which are related to the kind of employees you may have. WA, for instance, will have something of this sort alongside the national standards. Look at also the legislation that applies to you and applies generally within the whole business of teaching and learning. 1.3, an explanation of ways to promote equality and diversity. Promoting equality and valuing diversity, look at how your students relate to one another, show how they show respect for one another, and also promoting equality and diversity in terms of the way in which you establish the kind of roles individuals have and the kind of ground rules individuals have within a particular course. Remember, the ground rules shouldn't be just applied willy-nilly. They're about the whole business of having joint agreement between yourself as a responsible person and also the group you're working with in what is acceptable in terms of ground rules in both sides of the fence. It's not possible, for instance, for to establish ground rules which people can't comply with. You need ground rules which are fair, which promote this idea of everybody having an equal access to both the facilities and the involvement of the kind of courses you're teaching, and also that they feel that they are treated as individuals in which their needs are supported. Finally, in 1.4, an explanation of why it's important to identify and meet individual needs. Look at Maslow. Look at how individual needs refer to the basic needs of individuals as they go up Maslow's hierarchy. Look at also specific needs which relate to the people concerned. Think about how you write a group profile, for instance, which gives a clear overview of how individual needs are being met. Think about people's literacy, numeracy, and other needs, ICT needs, for instance, and how these are really important in terms of the way people advance through their learning. Look at their capacity as in terms of their culture, in terms of their social background, in terms of their economic and financial welfare, of how these needs need to be supported in terms of the way in which their learning is progressed. Okay, that's part A. Part B, an explanation of ways to maintain a safe and supportive learning environment. Safety means health and safety at work to a certain extent, but it also means psychological and emotional safety. So discuss how psychological and emotional safety within your group and in your environment is maintained. Look at ways of preventing things like harassment, bullying, and other forms of problem may occur. And look at specifically at the ways in which your environment is kept safe by things like health and safety reviews. By the way, excuse the noise in the background, we've got a bus outside and an ambulance by the sound of things. Point 2.2, an explanation of why it's important to promote appropriate behaviour and respect for others. Look at again at the business of how ground rules operate here, but also what this thing of what appropriate behaviour is. Talk about what appropriate behaviour in groups is, in terms of the various age groups, in terms of the various cultures you may be involved with, and then how you adapt these in the way in which your teaching and the planning you do operate. Okay, that's part B. Part C, an explanation of how teaching roles involve working with other professionals. Think about the other people you work with in the organisations you work for. These are not just other teachers, though clearly these are the most important ones, not just other managers as well. Sorry, I had an interruption. I may edit that later on. Not just in terms of not just in terms of teachers, but and other managers, but also the whole business of how you work with other students, with other student teachers, how you have a mentorship role, how you work with people like admin staff, catering staff, with caretaking staff, and so on and so forth. So this involves a huge number of other people who are part of the support system who work in teaching and learning. Part 3.2 in Part C looks at an explanation of the boundaries between the teaching role and other professional roles. So look at the business of where your role ends, what clear contents of your role are, and where your professional role ends. What are the boundaries here? Think well about that. Think about how it impacts upon the way in which you operate as a teacher, and what you can and can't do, and can and can't advise on, and can and can't support. Part 3, a description of points of referral to meet the individual needs of learners. Think about things such as where specific issues crop up, who you might refer to in terms of the kind of issues that you commonly come across: literacy, numeracy, ICT, social issues, issues about emotional and psychological support, and so on, where it falls outside the boundaries of the support you can give and who you might refer on. Be specific about that. Just don't talk generally, talk about the people you could refer to. Part D. Now remember, this assignment, like all the other assignments, has to be marked by you before you hand it in. Please note, I will reject it if the marking of your own work is not done. So Part B says you must ensure that all the assessment criteria for the unit are met within your report by marking your own work using the sheet on page 2 and attaching the sheet to your work when you hand it in. Don't forget to do this. Okay, don't forget. If it's not there, I will hand the work back to you, and you need to be able to get down and do that extra bit of marking. It should be a fairly quick job. You mark against the criteria on the second sheet on the assignment brief. Have a look at it. Check to make sure you're covering the criteria. And the way in which you're doing that is not just ticking off the boxes where there's a little slot, but also saying which page or which section of your assignment the evidence for this criteria occurs on. Okay, this is the first stab at this business of doing these kinds of work. So I shall now stop recording and hope this sounds okay. If I have to do a bit of editing because of the interruption, I shall do that later. Thank you.